Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Day 2 of the Interconnection Process Enhancements Track 2 effort initiative. And I just want to sort of kick off the morning with a huge thank you to all of you for your engagement yesterday and just really good active participation. So lots of really good discussion, and look forward to continuing it this morning. So before I kind of talk about what we're going to cover today, I have Katie who's going to give us a quick safety briefing. I know we have a few new people in the room, so quick reminder, so come on up.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Katie Kirshner, and I'm a business continuity analyst here at the ISO. I know many of you probably heard our safety briefing yesterday, but for those of you that weren't here yesterday, I'm just going to take the next couple minutes and relay actions needed during a shelter-in-place, lockdown, evacuation, or medical emergency. During an emergency response event, audible and visual alarms may go off, as well as a public announcement system that will instruct on the situation and next steps. Our ISO staff also receive emergency notifications on their phone, so they'll also know next steps to take. If it isn't safe to evacuate due to a hazard, we just ask that you stay where you are, seek cover if needed, and wait for further instructions. Additionally, if we need to lock down, we can engage all the doors by using the key on the red placards. Please know that our highly trained security officers will mitigate any threat and keep us all safe. In the event of an evacuation, please stay calm and follow ISO staff to the visitors parking lot and northern evacuation zones, or doors to the cafe will lead you to our southern evacuation zones. If you're not feeling well or see a medical emergency, please say something to our ISO staff. They will notify our security officers who are first aid and AED trained, and they will call 911 and render any aid until first responders arrive. And then just as a final note, our restrooms are down the hall and to the left. And then on behalf of the ISO emergency response team, thank you for trusting us with your safety.
Thanks very much, Katie. Appreciate that. So in terms of, is everything okay with the? Okay, yeah. So Caitlin, you want to just do an intro just from a WebEx perspective, so everybody online, sort of some housekeeping rules. So go ahead, Caitlin.
Yeah, sure. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Day 2 of the Interconnection Process Enhancement Track 2 Working Group. For those who are joining by WebEx today, I will run through a few housekeeping reminders. Again, this call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. These are collaborative working groups and intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives. We do ask that you keep your comments professional and respectful and try to refrain from repeating from what has already been said. And then if you are joining on WebEx today, a few ways to raise your hand or ask a question. If you're connected to audio using your computer, using the Call Me option, you can select the raise hand icon at the bottom right of your screen. That'll add you to the queue to ask your question. If you're joining us using audio only, you can press #2 and that'll add you to the queue as well. Since this is a hybrid event, when making your question or comment, please remember to state your name and affiliation beforehand. And if you do need any technical assistance during today's meeting, you can send a chat to the event producer. I know also if your audio or whatever is having a difficult time connecting, you could add your question or comment into the chat box as well, and I will read it aloud for you. So that is it for me, Joanne. I'll hand it back to you.
Great, thanks. Thanks for all that. Okay, so before I jump into sort of the agenda for today, I did want to mention we've got quite a few ISO staff in the room that I just wanted to call out. I do hope that this is an opportunity to engage with them in person. So I guess I'm going to start over here with Ryan, if you want to state your name and your role.
Hello, my name is Ryan with the queue management team at the CAISO. Roxana Kayam, Queue Management at the ISO.
Julie Balch, Grid Asset.
Hi, Linda Wright, Interconnection Specialist, ISO.
Debbie Rowe.
Grid assets.
I have Kaylee Zuberry, Grid Assets.
All right, great. And then Jeff in the front.
Yeah, it's Jeff Billington, Director of Transmission Infrastructure Planning.
Okay. Did we get everybody in the room?
Last one.
There you go.
Kelsey Campbell, Queue Management.
Thanks, Kelsey. Okay. And then online? Jason, did you want to?
So with the queue management team online, Jill Jordan is our lead queue management specialist, and then Daniel Velasquez, who's a new team member on the queue management team.
Great. So just want to call out those individuals, so it's a good opportunity to engage with them. They're the ones that are working the active interconnection queue, and you'll likely interface with them. So a good opportunity to sort of connect in person.
Joanne, I just want to just kind of recognize my team as well as Jason's team of interconnection specialists and all you folks out there, the ones that are in the trenches doing all this work, dealing with 550 interconnection requests and all of the MMAs and all these type of things. And some of these folks I'm sure you know from over the years, but some of them are more new. And you know, now that we're not doing the scoping meeting, results meetings in face-to-face, you know, you may not have met them, so make sure that if you haven't talked to them, if you haven't actually met them face-to-face, to go encounter them during this time and get to know them a little bit better. And again, just my thanks to all of the teams for all their hard work. This whole thing would not work if it weren't for them.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Perfect. Thanks. All right. So for today, I know the team worked last night on problem statement number 1 and the principle, so they've done some refinements of that. But before we get into sort of a review of that, we're going to sort of build on yesterday's momentum and get into problem statement number 2. So once we then get through problem statement number 2, we'll then come back and do a review of those principles and that problem statement number 1. Okay? So that's the plan for this morning. Did I miss anything, Danielle? Nope. Great. All right, so I'll turn it over to Jason, we're gonna jump right in to problem statement number 2.
Yeah, Caitlin, can you provide me share access on the WebEx, please?
Yeah, I just gave you presenter rights, so just click share. Let me know if that doesn't work.
Perfect. That was exactly what we needed. All right. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you got a good night's rest and we're ready to rock and roll this morning. Everybody in the room seems to have had their coffee, so let's jump in. So yesterday in the principles discussion, we did agree to sort of hold on that principle number 4, the managing the queue topic. We wanted to get through some of the why and data discussion today. We'll circle back to that by the end of this discussion and see if what's there works or if we want to refine it a little bit. Just a quick review of the problem statement. I'll just read it aloud so we're all sort of seeing and hearing the same thing. Following the study process, many projects in the interconnection queue do not proceed to commercial operation as expected. The current processes for managing the queue do not facilitate a timely development process, and a number of projects remain in the queue without indication of their near-term viability or intent to proceed to contracting or construction. We had a lot of really good stakeholder feedback, a lot of kind of direct feedback, some questions to consider. And really at the end of the day, there's not one answer here to how to solve this managing the queue problem. And so we'll go into some of the ISO pain points here, and then we'll get into some of the why, why are we bringing this up? Why is this a topic? Why is it a problem? Or why are we talking about it? Yep. Can we scroll down? All right, perfect. So just to walk through some of the ISO pain points and the reason that we brought this to the table, in the queue management team, we currently have, as of today, approximately 65 or 70 active modification requests. That includes material modifications, post-COD modifications, suspension requests, construction sequencing requests, sort of any modification to a project or a reason for delay, whatever the case might be, or technical modifications. At one point earlier this year, we had over 85 modification requests, and that is just a huge volume of requests to process at one time, right? And so sort of to step back. Sorry. Nope. Yeah, good. Just X out of here. Yeah. Thank you. You know, just to step back and kind of share the process and the extensiveness of processing a modification request. It's very similar to when we receive an interconnection request application, right? We receive that application, we review it for completeness to ensure that the package and the details that are being requested and the material that supports that is also submitted. We then move into validation, and many of you know that that can take, you know, as little as a month if we're lucky and things are submitted really cleanly, and it can take 6, 7, 8 months sometimes, right? And we can see a number of iterations back and forth. Then we move into the study process, and the study process is, you know, per the tariff, you know, guided towards 45 days to complete that study. If you look at our MMA statistics, you can see that many study processes are taking much longer than 45 days. So to see an active queue list of even 65 to 70 today is an extensive workload, not for just the queue management team, but for the industry as a whole, right? PTOs, customers are having to make these same level of responsibilities. The second item here is, you know, we have some level of concern with projects lingering in the queue. A number of projects, and we'll see some more statistics here in just a minute, but a number of projects are not proceeding to negotiations and ultimately execution of their GIA. So they're not making, you know, in some terms maybe good faith efforts to proceed to that GIA negotiation and execution, which then progresses to construction and so forth. We see a number of requests for CODs, delays, and COD extensions beyond that 7-year mark, right? And there's opportunities to retain deliverability beyond that 7 years, and there's also consequences for delaying and not meeting those criteria to delay beyond that 7 years. And sort of the consequence there is the conversion to energy only, and we're seeing a significant volume of energy only projects right now in the queue, and we'll see the numbers here in just a minute. And then, you know, the question then becomes, you know, what are the mechanisms and what are the tools we can use to hold these projects accountable when we see this occurring, right? Are projects actually proceeding to construction? Are they not? Why are they not? And we get into some of those questions a little bit later. Some of the questions and ideas that we had is, how do we balance being laissez-faire and just letting the system run itself versus being over the top in how we apply the restrictions and the consequences that are applicable in the GIAs and the tariff and that type of thing, and sort of, you know, what's too little and what's too much, and how do we find that balance in the middle? And then we heard yesterday, and we've heard a lot of stakeholders provide concerns about how we hold PTOs accountable for, you know, upgrades and their PTO extensions and the development timelines that we're seeing. So how do we balance some of that? And like I mentioned earlier, you know, there's really not a one answer fits all type of solution here. We have to evaluate any number of factors, any number of variables that fall into here, and try to determine, you know, what are those firm factors that we can hold projects accountable to, and then what do we have to balance in the remaining of those factors. And then, of course, how do we apply that consistently? So if we apply those factors to one project, how do we consistently apply those across the board for everybody? And balancing that based on status of the project, construction, not construction, GIA. Again, you're applying all those factors and variables there. Why don't we pause right here really quick just to see if there's any questions in the room or online. Questions or comments?
We do have a couple online.
All right, go ahead, Caitlin. I'll let you run that.
Okay. Let's start with Susan Schneider.
Hi, Susan.
Consulting, can you hear me okay?
Yes. Good morning.
Okay. Morning. Couple things. First of all, I want to compliment the CAISO for taking this on, because this is one of those other elephants in the room that, trying to do things to projects after they're already in the queue, I know is a very fraught kind of process, and it takes a little bit of courage to get out there and even propose to do this. But it really is, without addressing the huge bulk of what's in the queue, you're going to, dealing with it, you'll be dealing with it at the edges. So definitely, thank you so much for taking this on. I had a process question and a substance comment. I noticed that some of the details, I know probably things have to be cleaned up from yesterday and all that. This is very, very interesting and useful information that you've just gone through, and you're going to go through these statistics. Again, I hope that you will post this on the website when you're done, so people who aren't in the workshop will have access to it. But those of us even that are following this will be able to refer to it later, because this is really important that you've just gone through this process. They're really good questions, and the information is very useful. So I hope that you will post this when you're done with the workshop here as part of a wrap up, if that's possible.
Yeah, Susan, we do plan to put together probably a single document that has the revised principles and both problem statements. And we'll determine what level of information we actually include in that document, whether we summarize the stakeholder comments like we did in the presentations and discussions. But yes, we will certainly post something to share what we're presenting.
The stakeholder comments, but also the things you've just gone through here with the ISO points, the Q statistics, all these things, very, very helpful information. And I hope that you'll include that in the package as well.
Sounds good. We'll certainly consider it. I don't want to make promises today, but we hear you loud and clear. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And then if you could just go back to the actual statement. I just had a very bit of a nit on the language. I don't know if you're actually looking for that right now, but when you say the updated thing where it says they don't proceed as expected, and you're basically trying to say they don't execute a GIA, but they do continuously extend. So I think if you're going to make a decision, you say execute a GIA, fail to follow the milestones, or don't execute a GIA and then continuously extend. It's either things they do or things they don't do. And I think that would be, just in terms of the language would make a little more sense.
Yeah, thank you for that feedback.
Okay.
And certainly, if anybody has comments directly to either the principle number 4 or the red lines, happy to take those as they come.
Okay, thanks very much. That's all I've got now. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Susan. Caitlin?
Next on WebEx, we have Jason Bierwin with GridStore.
I also want to echo thank you to the ISO and to the folks in the room for the work that you are doing. The pace of transition is in this room, so we all take this very seriously. My question was, has the ISO ever sort of systematically surveyed or otherwise discussed with interconnection customers the reason they cite for not proceeding to IA, and has an informed view as to why that is the case, or does that remain unclear? The reason I ask is because that could inform the formation of this problem.
So I would say we have not formally surveyed that. I want to take that and sort of put it on pause. I have some considerations here on this paper that we can talk through as a group about each stakeholder's perspective, right? PTO, ISO perspective, developer perspective, policy perspective. So let's I hear you on that one. If we can put a pin in it just for a little while through this conversation, I think we'll circle back to that. And maybe it's something that we can explore doing a bigger survey outside of just this discussion as well.
Thanks.
And then we did have a comment in the chat from Bo Baczynski with Diamond Generating Corporation, just saying CAISO needs to be aware of delays in transmission build-out to obtain deliverability needed for RA CEQA, permitting delays, supply chain delays and delays or changes in opportunities for off-takers. But that's all we have online for the moment, Jason.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Caitlin. Let's keep going. Can we scroll down? Yeah, perfect. Just a hair bit more. Oh, Kathleen, sorry.
No worries. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Just before we move on to more stats, on the problem statement, something that I heard yesterday, and I wanted to connect it to your problem statement. I know a lot of what you're buying is post-study queue management, or all, so I'm going to just say a lot.
Yeah.
I heard, but we discussed a lot yesterday that was actually like normal study process inefficiencies as well. And whether it was manual, automation, how do we streamline, how do we improve, how do we go from phase 1 to phase 2. So I feel like we scoped through the interconnection discussion really well, interconnection requests kind of through phase 1. But I would ask you to consider in your problem statement, I did hear a lot that seemed normal process, study process of phase 1, phase 2 kind of transitions before we even get to the post-study challenges. So I might add that for completeness to the problem statement.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? I just want to make sure I fully understand what you're kind of intending to refer to.
One of the things that I think we talked about was a desire for how to automate some of these studies, which studies, what level of detail, but how to automate it, how to streamline it on the PTO side, right? How do you, both the PTO and the ISO side, as well as the IC, like what efficiencies could we be gained?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I received that, and I'm just gonna, this is a summary of yesterday for me, I guess, to some extent. But I received that as folks identifying problems or challenges with the normal study process with the size that we now have. And so I think that the sheer magnitude of Cluster 14 has identified that the way that we do normal process needs a revisit as well.
Okay. So just revisiting how we do our processes today. Sure.
Yeah,
this is Bob.
Yes,
Bob, remember, just so you know, I mean, we decided not to recap the principles and problem statement number 1 in order to give Jason more time, because I'm thinking it just may take some time, but that is one of the problem statements within problem statement, or one of the components within problem statement 1. So it's captured, and so it will be addressed. So I anticipate that when we get into solutions into that area, that we'll have discussions around that and have to do some investigations of what's the realm of possibility in that area.
And I would iterate that we can bring that same concept into this managing the queue section as well.
That would be great. Thanks for the clarification.
All right. It's a bit small, but we wanted to get it all on one page. So there's a lot of numbers here. I'm not going to hit every cell and every column or every row. There's a few highlights I think we want to make. So there's been some discussions and some questions about, and questions about why are we having this conversation? What is it that's driving us to say, projects are lingering in the queue, or making statements that projects are lingering in the queue? And one of the questions is energy-only deliverability status projects, and what does that mean for commercial procurement, right? Our load-serving entities and other off-takers actually purchasing energy-only products. If they're in the queue and we're not seeing procurement, then we get into this viability discussion about how viable are they, and what does that mean for the queue, and is it impacting other projects, and so forth. So wanted to share some of the details here and just highlight that all of this is public information. I went into the ISO queue report, pulled off all of the left columns except the last. The last column is a bit of statistics on who requested deliverability as an energy-only project and ultimately received and achieved commercial operation as a full capacity or partial capacity project. So let's start on the left. This is statistics by cluster. You can see here that we're looking at the number of, the second column here, the number of IRs that were submitted into that queue, and we've seen this number of times, but just to kind of highlight the volume and the increase of it. We also put the queue date here just to highlight that 7-year mark in the queue. So we can see that cluster 9 and earlier is beyond that 7-year mark in the queue, and we're approaching cluster 10 being in that 7-year mark in the queue. The third column here is just current active IRs, so we can just see that there's with cluster 14, there's 462 active IRs and 187 gigawatts of capacity, and that's installed capacity. If we take out cluster 14 that's currently in the study process, we have 257 active interconnection requests, and I think it's 94 gigawatts of capacity, of installed capacity. We can see here, executed, not executed. There's, of the 257, 171 have executed GIAs and 86 do not. So, as we start looking at cluster 12 and 13, they become a little more questionable on have they hit the right time to execute GIAs, but anything earlier than that, the question becomes, should they have already executed their GIA and proceeded to commercial operation? Again, kind of bringing up the viability aspect here. And then we get into the energy-only status projects. We just want to highlight that there's currently 78 projects in the queue and over 24 gigawatts of capacity as energy-only status existing in the queue. So then one of the questions came up was, well, how many energy-only projects have actually achieved commercial operation? And this was an interesting find as well, right? So we look back, we can highlight the 14 projects and 900 megawatts of capacity that achieved commercial operation as energy-only. Some of the asterisks here, the single asterisk here is SGIP and fast track projects, which is a number of the 14, are energy only by nature. They came into the queue as energy only, and they didn't have an opportunity at that time to seek an allocation. Then we get into the actual queue. We can see that some of the early clusters had less than 50 megawatts in 3 projects, and then there's only been 1 project, according to our queue, to achieve commercial operation as an energy only project, and it was a 20 megawatt battery storage project. And then the last element here, like I previously touched on, is who or how many projects and megawatts achieved commercial operation after seeking a TPD allocation as an energy-only project, right? So they either came into the queue or they were converted to energy-only, remained in the queue, somehow qualified for one of the groupings, either 4, 5, 6, or 7, or in 2023, A, B, C, or D, I believe, and ultimately received an allocation. Well, they wouldn't have been in this last because they've already achieved commercial operation. So 4, 5, 6, or 7, they received an allocation and then ultimately came online. Okay, there it is. I will pause here, and I saw Rayanne's hand go up first, so Rayanne.
Thanks, Jason. Good morning, everyone. This is Rayanne Quadro with Gridwell Consulting. I definitely want to stay away from solution space here as we talk, but sure. You do keep touching on 7 years as a delineator for, how long a project should stay in queue. And I just wanted to provide some sort of context on that as we think about it. That 7 years was identified sort of in a previous iteration of a study process, procurement process, TPP process that has gone through a lot of maturation and changes since then. Mm-hmm. Also, not to date myself, but certainly at that time, upgrade timelines were much shorter. It used to be that you could bring a project on in 6 months, and that was totally reasonable. And now you're not getting an executed GIA with less than 13 months. And that's just for engineering and project management and telecom, right? That's no upgrade.
Sure.
So my thought is, as we go through this, we should all consider whether 7 is the right number or whether there's a right number at all, whether it's really a qualitative evaluation, not a hard line in the sand.
Yeah, fair enough. I don't disagree with you. So yeah, we'll keep that in mind. Aisha?
Hi, this is Aisha Bari from Recurrent Energy. Just a couple of comments or notes or questions.
Sure.
One, if I understand, the tariff doesn't enforce any time window or limit on negotiation of an IA and execution, and I would love corrections if that is, because oftentimes delays, while the developers could be lingering on it, sometimes even execution take longer than expected. And for various reasons, the delays may happen from the PTO's end. I wonder if there is a thought on putting a limit to IA negotiation and execution after the reassessment studies are out or phase 2 studies are out. That is one. Second, I was going to ask if suspensions were included, but since you mentioned these are current active IRs, so we are not considering suspensions in this list. This doesn't entail any kind of suspensions.
So suspensions would show up in this list. It's just suspensions would be a separate status,
okay.
But they would still be an active IR.
Okay, all right. I had one more thought.
Well, let me touch on, think about your thought. Let me touch on your
yeah.
IA negotiations.
Yeah.
I don't believe there's any hard date or timeline limitation to enforce a GIA must be executed by X time following a phase 2 study or as you sit in the queue, though there is pretty specific tariff language around progressing towards negotiation and execution, right? And that's sort of there's a bit of gray area there, I think, through that language, but what the ISO would like to see and want to work towards is ensuring that stakeholders and projects and PTOs and all the parties continue that progress in the negotiation efforts, right? We understand that negotiations can go back and forth and take time to, draft and redline and make that effort, but when projects aren't responding to communications and they're sitting on the GIAs, whether it's the PTO or the customers or even the ISO sometimes, right? We need to minimize that communication lag and continue the progress to execution. That's the ultimate goal.
Since this point came, so examining the 7-year time frame, I definitely agree. We need to revisit that,
Sure.
especially for cluster 14 and 15, where the studies themselves are taking so long. So definitely need to, reconsider that number.
Yeah. Very much understand the points on 7 years. Yeah.
We do have a hand raised online.
Perfect.
Let's go to Susan Schneider.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. A couple of comments. I wanted to follow up on Carrie's thought about 7 years. The whole TPD allocation process was added to the end of the study process, and even under the normal process where you don't have an extra year for studies, that delayed things several months, and then you throw the reassessment on top of that. Perhaps sometimes. Sometimes the things get delayed because you now have a study process that takes many more months than it used to take before. Even if it's only a 2-year process when you do the TPD allocation and then the reassessment. And then often if there's an MMA request pending, well, then people want to delay it for that reason. Also, it is very, very common in my experience that the PTOs they're short on labor, and sometimes, trying to process and get those GIs out the door, you wait a long time just to get a draft. And then the turnaround times are very long. And then every time even minor changes are made, you have dates in there, the dates get out of date because everything's taken so long, and then they have to go through the process all over again. And it's taken as much as 4 to 6 months to get an approval of a GIA from the PTOs sometimes. So if there's anything that could be done to help the PTOs process those faster, or not have to review things for minor wording changes to go through the whole process all over again, I think that process probably could use a little bit of examination here as well. And then as far as the suspensions, I think since the CAISO was proposed to take, at least in the concept 1, I think it was in concept 1. No, I'm sorry. It was in the second part with the managing the accountability thing, where you propose to take away suspension rights. I know suspensions are annoying, and I do get that, but I have not seen very many of them, and I just wonder if it might be possible as part of this process, or as we're going through this initiative, to get some statistics on suspensions. It's not even really a unilateral right anymore. It's something you have to ask permission for. If it gets in the way of anybody else, you can't do it. You can't suspend anything that's shared. It's pretty limited. It's pretty restricted, and I'm just wondering how common is it, and is it really that big of a problem that you have to keep kind of going back to it? So it would be nice to get that information somewhere along the way.
Yeah, Susan, I think we'll get into the suspension discussion as we get into the solution space. Just to answer your question, though, it is not a common request today, but I think what we're trying to do is just eliminate that from the question. And so let's engage in that discussion deeper as we get into the solution world.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you.
And then we do have a question on the audio only line. Event producer, could you open up the line?
You're unmuted. You may go ahead. Please remember to unmute your device. We cannot hear you. Caller, be sure to unmute your device or yourself on the web. All right, we're unable to hear that caller.
All right, we'll try again later. Let's come back into the room here. Kathleen, you have a comment?
Great, thank you. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Thanks, Jason, for sharing this data. This is helpful for the discussion. I had two things I wanted to kind of comment on the queue and the information about in the queue. So and kind of gets about the information accessibility that we were talking about yesterday.
Okay.
And I wanted to use the cluster 5 as an example. That's a single project, and it's a co-located solar. It's a photovoltaic and a storage unit. And so the 250 is the gross megawatt for those two individual components, but together the net megawatt that was requested for the project is 200. And I'm assuming part of why the data that we look at isn't exactly tracking to what you're showing, and this is why I looked at it while we were doing it, is that you're combining the growth in what you're reporting, showing here. That is a little confusing from a developer perspective, because what we're requesting is the net megawatt, right? That's the actual, and it's a combination, it's a co-located asset. So just a tiny piece of feedback to kind of think about when we talk about accessibility, that's a good example, right? You're showing a piece of information that makes a ton of sense to you, and I assume for very good reasons. It makes sense to look at it like this. From our perspective, it makes sense to look at the net megawatts, and that's all I look at for a project. And so what I think about, yeah, Ryan.
Just to clarify, the reason for the net megawatts is ultimately that's what's contractable. So whatever we have behind the meter is irrelevant. It's all about, what RA you're providing, and that calculation comes down to, or is limited by, the net megawatt interconnection.
Sure.
Thank you, Rayanne. That's super helpful clarification, and I hope that's helpful for the CAISO to kind of think about. But I have a second piece. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, let's pause there for a quick second. So Bob, I want to kind of sort of throw this your way a little bit. We intentionally looked at total capacity being installed so that we can compare that also to what our policy obligations are. And when we look at the 7,000 megawatts per year, are we looking at 7,000 megawatts at POI? Are we looking at 7,000 megawatts total installed capacity? And I think there's some alignment here on, we understand that there's certain reasons to look at POI, and then there's other certain reasons to look at total installed capacity. And so, Bob, I want to throw it to Bob, and then we'll come back, yeah.
Well, yeah, it's not a major point, but the point is, what are you trying to accomplish? What's the purpose of how you're looking at these numbers? And what Jason's referring to within the resource adequacy and reliability analysis work that we've done, we have to kind of split these up. How much storage do we have? How much solar, and all those kind of components? So we break it apart for those types of analyses. And so when Jason was showing these numbers, I said, well, it'd be kind of nice to be consistent with other reports that we put out there. So, it's not like we're trying to look at it in any particular way. It's just a matter of, maybe consistency of data. But we understand there's two ways of looking at it, and it's not like we're trying to make a certain point by looking at it one way or another.
That's helpful. I'll respond briefly, but also note this is another really good example of a clarification we could get from the CPUC. My understanding, having we participate in IRP, RA, all the above. It is not, a co-located is not looked at as two separate components. So it is not, as far as the portfolios and what is being modeled and kind of thought about as a part of the state plan, as far as I'm aware of, it is, if it's co-located, it is the net megawatt. So what you can offer up for IRP is not a combination. It is the effective injection at that point of interconnection that's being studied and brought to commercial operation.
Yeah, and that's a different issue than our internal resource adequacy type analysis for summer 2023, where we need to know how much solar is coming on, how much storage is coming on, and those type of issues. So, there's so many different realms that you can, slice and dice these numbers in different ways for the purposes they're being used for. So, again, we're not trying to do anything with demonstrating these numbers in a particular way to make a certain message. So we get your point. And
I think all Kathleen and I are really trying to drive through, this is Rayanne Quadro, Gridwell Consulting, for those on the phone, is that if we want to do an apples-to-apples comparison and have data that matches up as we identify trends, we have to come to an agreement on how we're going to do that. And to us, it makes the most sense to do it based on that net megawatt because it's contracting. And ultimately, if we are to infer from Jason's point this morning that only one project has come on, energy only, if you will, then that RA count is really where the meat of the matter is, right? Projects aren't coming on without having deliverability, presumably because they're not coming on without power purchase agreement.
I hope you don't think I'm arguing with you. I understand and agree. And so, yeah.
Well, Bob, it's Jeff here. I think Jared Ferguson from the CPUC wants to weigh in kind of on the IRP component.
Yeah, this is Jared Ferguson. I'm on the IRP team at the CPUC. Sorry about my voice. I had a cold over the weekend, and so I lost my voice. I just want to point out sort of to this discussion, and I guess sort of what we do on the CPUC side is we use both metrics sort of to think about it. So like on the RA side, on sort of the reliability side, we do care about that. What is the NQC of the resources? So that's sort of like the combined resources, that net megawatts to grid. But on our planning side, we're actually mapping the net megawatts, the net nameplate megawatts, and we are looking at sort of both like the solar megawatts and the storage megawatts behind that net megawatt grid from our TPP portfolio development approach. So we use, I guess, at the CPUC, we're looking at both metrics depending on what it's being used for.
Rayanne Quadro again. So in this venue, I mean, do you have an opinion on what would be the most helpful, consistent vocabulary?
So, I mean, this is probably my bias because I work on the transmission planning side of things.
Put it out
but
there.
I mean, that's what, I mean, so, but I say, like, I feel like the RA team and then our IRP team who works on the procurement side of things. So I think sort of both are useful, just sort of to your point earlier, just clarifying how the information is being presented, is that helpful? So just so we know if it's an apple or an orange. It's sort of like we can do our own sort of then interpolation of that data if we know it's an apple or an orange. So I would say just sort of stating this is sort of the net total megawatts and not the net megawatts to grid kind of information is probably the easiest and most helpful to do.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. Sushant?
Yeah, I think drawing on the same discussion, I wanted to add a sub-topic under this problem statement was around this issue where the CPUC portfolio has identified a huge energy-only build-out in that total. The number used to be, I think, 86 gigawatt. Now it's a little smaller. The link between FCDS amount and the energy-only in the portfolio is that a lot of that energy-only is assumed to be co-located and very unlikely that it will be built without the deliverable amount getting TPD allocation. And so in the queue management problem statement, I think we need to look at how do we enable TPD allocation on the right time scale so that all the energy only that's required also gets built. And that's where we see that being as a future pain point where without making some changes to TPD allocation and the escalating requirements for being eligible for TPD allocation, a lot of active queued projects will not have access to that, and as a result, we may see a gap in even that energy-only build-out. So I think some way to handle that within this problem statement would be great.
We do have a couple questions on the WebEx.
Yeah, go ahead, Caitlin.
Okay, the first one was just a comment in the chat, or question in the chat from Keith Ban at San Diego Gas and Electric. How are executed EMP letter agreements counted as part of the GIA executed or not executed data?
So that is not accounted for in here. This is just queue report specific. It does not take into account any construction activities with the PTOs. Good question, though. And that's certainly, maybe that's a factor we need to consider here too, is we'll call it viability of a project. Have they executed an EMP and moving towards that construction activity? Thanks, Keith.
And then we have Paris Hayes on the line. Go ahead. And then produce, oh, there we go.
Hi, this is Paris Hayes from Night Peak Energy. Sorry, I was having technical difficulties earlier, but just really appreciate the opportunity to participate today. And also really great to just hear so much constructive dialogue from every direction. So thank you. So one thing that we kind of noticed as part of the IPE Track 2 discussion is there's a lot of, when we're talking about things like transmission zones and so forth, it really sounds like we're talking about deliverability, and that there's an issue of deliverability and how that's going to be allocated. And I think one thing that we just want to mention that really shouldn't get lost in the discussion is that no matter what proposal is adopted, there should always be an avenue for new generators to be able to participate in the LMP-based energy markets. And currently that you're able to do so through an energy-only project. In our case, we focus on battery development, and so that's something we're really keyed in on. And so, just kind of as a principle, as long as there's access to the LMP markets for new generators, and that we don't get blocked because we're not in a transmission zone, or we wanted to do a project in the wrong polygon on the map or something. That's just something that we've been thinking a lot about. So yeah, appreciate the comment. I think that kind of wraps it up for me. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right,
Caitlin, anything else?
Online.
Okay, thank you. Kathleen, then we'll keep going.
Thanks, Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. So the second thing I wanted to raise for you was that, I looked at the queue a little bit after reading the discussion paper, and particularly your section, something that I wanted to look at, and so I'm going to suggest you also look at it this way. But one thing that I looked at is which projects have a current online date that is passed. Yeah. It is a different way of looking at this particular challenge in question, but I found it interesting. Granted, it's not a lot, and I'm going to acknowledge that it's not a huge portion of the queue, but it is a very interesting fact that there is a not insignificant amount of projects that are in the queue that their online date is past due, and some significantly, like 2010, bye-bye, significantly past due. And that is different than the way that you're framing the problem, the way that you're framing it. I'm hearing a problem statement about I have a line of sight, know what my milestone is, I keep updating it, I'm communicating, versus I have a project that looks stale. Like, that's what it looks like from the outside, right?
Yep.
It looks like we've got about 40 projects and about 5,000 or so net megawatts to grid that fit this, and I know it's a small portion, but I worry with I'm just worried with the size that it becomes a snowball, and so that is one issue that I saw when I looked at it.
Yeah, so we're very aware of that point as well. In fact, I would, not to get into too much detail here, but I would let everybody know that the contract negotiations team and the queue management team are working on some efforts to evaluate that situation and then take the right steps and measures to mitigate it so that that information is, one, the data is staying updated. And I think there's various reasons for why we see that on the queue report, which we won't go into, but also we're taking big steps this year, and I think we'll see much of it be implemented into next year, of how do we hold projects accountable and looking at simply milestones, you know, whether we're looking at sync and COD of those projects and what's coming in the next 1, 3, 5, 7, or what's past due, right? And then we're looking at 1, 3, 5, 7, 12 months out and saying, are you actually going to meet those milestones? And if not, what's the right next step to extend that or X, fill in the blank.
In my research, so I tried to find out if there was a specific tariff provision or a manual. I alluded to this yesterday, but I'm gonna lean in harder. I think it is a part of the problem statement I'd like to see us evaluate is it clear what the obligation is for maintaining accurate milestones for projects? I think is a problem statement I would like to see incorporated. And I'd like your expertise to review. I did not do a comprehensive review, but I am worried that perhaps with the ambiguity that it does not have clear guidelines for what that is. So how long, what is the grace period before a project is required to update their milestone with the best information available seems to be a bit silent.
Yep.
And I'd like to see it addressed. Thank you.
Understand, yeah, thank you. All right, I'm not seeing any other hands raised in there. Oh, Andrew?
Hi, Andrew Webster from QSOLs. I have a question related to the discussion paper. More stringent queue management policies were discussed as kind of having a relationship or complementing the current commercial viability criteria. I just wanted to ask if you could like elaborate on kind of what that looks like in the future when you would imagine that being implemented. Yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think, I don't want to elaborate on it here because it's very much a solution-based discussion. So I'm not ignoring your question. Let's defer that to the solution discussion if you're okay with that.
Okay, yeah, no problem.
Is that fair? Okay.
Yeah, that's fair, thank
All
you.
right, thanks, Andrew. Okay. What time is it? Should we keep going or take a little break? Keep going? Okay, let's keep going. If we could, please, yeah. I think we're good with stats. Let's go to the next section. Perfect, okay. So this section here is considerations, and it was really a culmination of all the stakeholder feedback that we've heard, both verbally and through the stakeholder comments that we received. And I even went back and refined it a little bit last night based on yesterday's discussion around viability and some other things. So, and then, yeah, so let's just hit these one at a time. And I'm going to keep running unless I see hands raised or we hear something online. So the first consideration here, you know, in light of yesterday's conversation as well, was how do we define viable and relative to the projects proceeding through the queue, what does it mean to be viable while you're proceeding to commercial operation and maintaining that viability until you achieve that commercial operation status? You know, it's probably important to somehow identify the metrics for whether a project is proceeding, you know, without interconnection customer delay or development delay. PTO delay and other delays can obviously play a factor in that, but that sort of adds to how we determine the viability. And then, of course, when and how do we apply that viability in deciding if a project should be proceeding or potentially identifying it as a project that should be withdrawn. We talked about yesterday some elements that are quantifiable and maybe other elements that are less quantifiable. How do we put measures or limitations around GIA execution, some of those GIA milestones that we just talked about? How do we, you know, some of those some of these milestones in the GIAs, if you've ever opened one up, I mean, we need a Gantt chart and a bubble chart to follow, you know, if-thens and this and that, and they can get very complicated, and they're not easy to track or follow, and sometimes they're frankly not easy to, you know, hold projects accountable to, because everybody has a different answer and reason why they haven't met that milestone, and there's sometimes a lot of finger pointing as well, right? Interconnection financial security postings, those have pretty hard lines in for the first and second security postings, and then the third security posting is generally based on those GIA milestones. Notice to proceed as well, site exclusivity, status reports being submitted, and milestones within the status reports, PPAs being executed, mostly relative to deliverability, retention, and then some other things that I heard both in some one-on-one discussions yesterday, but also I think we're hearing is, you know, what if we're talking about project viability, you know, and not just looking at it from an ISO perspective, but from a project perspective, what is the project success in RFOs? Have you bid on 3 RFOs and not been successful in any? Is your project, you know, meeting those qualifications and quantifiable relative to the RFO and the purchase or procurement aspects? And one other interesting thing that came up as well was, what is an overall developer success rate in developing projects? So if a project is putting in 10 interconnection requests into the queue, are they building all 10 of them? Are they building one of them? Are none of them getting built? And it'd be interesting to do some evaluations and quantify what that statistic looks like, right? Some other less quantifiable measures, of course, people resources. We had a good discussion yesterday and heard some good feedback on that. Permitting, you know, when we say permitting, there's not just one permit for a project, right? It's not, did you submit for this permit? There's a whole slew of different permits, from land rights to environmental to building to CEQA to you name it, right? And how do we quantify or qualify that to fit it into project viability? Upgrade delays, what does start of construction actually mean? We always talk about shovels in the ground, but, you know, is procurement happening? What's the status of construction? What does that actually mean? PPA negotiations and being on a short list. We've seen some, you know, claims of supply chain problems or COVID-19 delays, right? So those are a little bit less quantifiable. Some other considerations is, how do we evaluate opportunities for projects to achieve commercial operation ahead of lengthy upgrades? So this is referring to the limited operation study that the ISO we currently have as an option in the tariff. There's been questions and, you know, the desire to look for opportunities to do that evaluation earlier in the process, to say, to what extent could these projects come online without those upgrades, but do that evaluation earlier in the process, if and how possible. So something that we could certainly look at. And then here's, Jason, this is getting back to your question earlier, is understand why projects are not proceeding to commercial operation. I think this is where I'd like to hear a little bit of the different stakeholders and perspectives on, you know, why are projects not proceeding to commercial operation? And, you know, developers, be as honest as you can and will with us, right? Why are you not proceeding? And is it causes on your side, and what are those causes? This is where the finger pointing can start happening. So I want to be careful in this conversation and how we're having the discussion. But, you know, I think we can look at this on the PTO ISO related side. What is it the PTOs and ISO is doing to cause these delays? What are ICs and project developers doing or not doing, or what's causing the delays on their end? Commercial procurement activities, you know, is there delays or disconnects on the procurement side? And then, you know, is there anything on the state policy side that's causing delays? All right, I'm gonna pause here and see if there's any feedback or comments.
We do have Susan Schneider on WebEx.
Yep, go ahead, Susan.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Just a couple of quick comments. I think the PPA issue is, I think that's a very interesting one, because I have seen more interest in the last in the last little while in merchant. And, you know, the CAISO market is mature. People are looking at LMP differentials. People are looking at alternatives to having PPAs, or maybe just short-term ones, or maybe none at all. And so I think that you know, there, in terms of, just instead of having PPAs be sort of a super important measure, which it probably still is, but I think you need to leave some room for other viability demonstrations that are alternatives to PPAs, like some other measures of financial viability, and not necessarily focusing exclusively on, you know, on PPAs to the extent that you do. So I'm not saying that there's a lot of people building that way, but I am seeing more interest in that, and certainly that, you know, there should be at least some room for that to happen. And then the other thing is the whole thing about energy only and deliverability. Seeing more energy only transactions now, I think, especially for solar, where in solar, you know, the RA is just not that much is not that valuable anyway. It's truly trending in the wrong direction pretty fast. And so a lot of the projects, I'm seeing more contracts for energy only. And so again, you need some alternative. I do think you need some viability measure as opposed to energy only projects just sitting around and not doing anything. But maybe allow room for that energy only build out to happen. And then finally, in terms of the developer record, I think that's very interesting. But I think that there are companies whose business proposition is basically to develop, you know, put in interconnection requests, develop projects to a certain degree, and then sell them to other people. And so they will maybe never complete a project. Or people who buy other people's projects, they will never initiate they will not initiate a project for those projects. They'll simply finish them. So you'll have to figure out. I think it's interesting, but you'll have to figure out how to deal with the things where sometimes projects change hands even more than once as they go, and how will you deal with that as far as looking at the developers in each of those stages. So interesting concept, though.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. All good points and well noted. I'm gonna stick online. Is there anybody else online that's got their hand up? Or comment?
No, not at this time.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna go with Aisha first, real quick. Aisha.
Hi, this is Aisha Bari from Recurrent Energy. So Jason, you bring up a very good question that you need to ask developers, is why they are not achieving commercial operation. For this particular piece, how do you want us to respond? Like, for example, as comments in a follow-up, like, you know, like we provided comments to the paper, do you want to issue like a separate comment exercise for stakeholders to provide a response? Or I'm pretty sure there's going to be very useful information.
Sure, yeah.
That'll come on the table.
So I would say that we're not necessarily looking for that data today to make a decision, but something to take into consideration as we get into the solution space, right? So, but how does this apply to the problem statement, and what can we include, if anything, that helps us realize the questions that we're asking here? Yeah. But if you're willing to share the information, by all means, email it to me, and I'm glad to take a look at it and have the conversation. Yeah. Rayanne?
Thanks, Jason. Okay. Rayanne Quadro, Gridwell Consulting. I know you heard my pitch for this yesterday, but I want to share it with the rest of the room. I'm thinking that there are a lot of developers, speaking as a consultant, who are not going to want to share that information with each other.
Fair.
And so I wonder if you would be willing to take the temperature of the room to see if folks would be willing to give that information in a more anonymous fashion, either via email to you or completely anonymous via some sort of survey function. So that you could gather the data without, you know, compromising anybody's anonymity, if you will.
Sure. Yeah, again, I wasn't necessarily seeking answers to the question per se, but just trying to raise the point of how does this apply to the problem statement. So if we get to the point of seeking that information, I'll certainly take that into account, and we'll do some, you know, some level of, yeah, keeping it confidential. Yeah, sure.
Hey, Jason, this is Bob Emmert. I just wanted to, I think there's probably enough questions out there that developers may not want to openly provide input on. So I think that's probably a good idea, that at some point in the process we should do an informal, or not informal, but anonymous type survey of specific issues that we're really seeking to dig into. I've heard some comments yesterday that to me were a bit head scratchers. And it's like, really, I didn't expect to hear that, and I'd like to know more. And I think probably the only way I'm going to get answers is to do something like that. So I think that's something we ought to take to consideration.
Is that I see initiated withdraw, but what you want to know is, why did you initiate your withdrawal, right? Or, you know, why aren't you proceeding? Like, that sort of why data is going to be more subjective and more of a narrative form necessarily than a, you know, clean data point.
Yeah, sure, yeah. Thank you, Rand. Kathleen, I'm going to go back to the corner here. So Jasmine, she hasn't spoke yet, so I want to give Jasmine an opportunity. Yeah, Jasmine, go ahead.
It's Jasmine, by the way, but this is Jasmine from AES Clean Energy. Just to shed light a little bit on like the causes of the delay, I think for us specifically, it's the idea of deliverability. We're waiting for upgrades, and because we're waiting for upgrades, we don't know the deliverability status, and therefore it trickles down as we are unable to try to get an off-take agreement, et cetera. But I know that there is some room right now for interim deliverability, and that's being explored in the deliverability stakeholder process, but that is, you know, it's potential to also what you're seeing for delay upgrades. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jasmine. All right.
We do have a couple hands up online whenever you're ready to.
Yeah, Kathleen has her hand up really quick, and then we'll jump to online. And Sushan too, okay.
Kathleen Glover from Vistra. I wanted to respond to something Susan said, and I think it's important to flag because I've realized that we're using a word differently among the community, and so in the spirit of words mean things, wanted to flag that we are using the word merchant differently. I heard Susan use the word merchant to refer to energy-only projects. That is not how I use the word merchant, and that is not what I believe the word merchant means. I don't necessarily need to debate it out, but it would help to use it consistently. You know, merchant is a competitive company that's not a load-serving entity. So a merchant developer has to do with what type of entity you are, not what type of projects you deliver. From the merchant community, that's how we use that word. So I'm a merchant developer that develops resource adequacy projects. And I want to make that really clear because I think sometimes when I say, well, we're merchant, so we have different challenges, you might be hearing, I'm doing an energy-only project, which is in no way, shape, or form accurate, because that is not what merchant means in the merchant developer community.
Okay.
And I wanted to help clarify that so that we could try to speak the same language.
Yeah, fair enough. And I know we talked yesterday, too, about using commercial and competitive, that type of thing, so certainly take the words into consideration, yeah. Sushant, and then we'll go online. Sushant, go ahead.
Thanks. Sushant from Clearway Energy. I had a question on interim deliverability. I saw some discussion of that in IPE Track 2. There was some mention on the deliverability initiative as well. I wanted to check but I didn't see a lot more details on the deliverability paper on creating a framework around interim deliverability. So if it's not included in that initiative, I think we should add it to the list here as well, because I think it addresses the point of keeping some of these projects alive and viable by offering them interim deliverability, especially if upgrades are delayed.
So real quick, I think my read on what you're referring to is we have the interim deliverability option once you achieve commercial operation ahead of a delivery network upgrade, right? And you can achieve interim deliverability through that mechanism. Are you referring to a mechanism by which you'd receive interim deliverability ahead of commercial operation to give you some...
And that points to what Jasmine was saying, that one of the reasons for failure, a lot of projects, if our upgrade is 7 years from now, we know there is interim deliverability today, but there's no framework to give a contractable assurance of that.
Sure.
Nobody contracts with that project, and that project fails. So there is some value being left on table. So maybe we include it here or in that other initiative.
Yeah, fair. Bob wants to jump in.
Yeah, this is Bob Emmer. There's two issues that I want to make sure everybody's clear about. First is just overall deliverability. We're not in the solution space here yet, but as we were writing up the various concepts within the discussion paper, it became very apparent that deliverability is just going to be front and center in any new concepts that we bring forward for solutions for problem statement number 1. Okay, so that's going to, without exception, is going to be a part of that discussion. what you're referring to about interim deliverability, we've heard from multiple sources that there is a desire to see a more robust process around that, to where someone that may have a PPA that's out there a while, number of years out there, but they want to be able to come online sooner. And because they are waiting for their D&U to be completed, is there a way to get online sooner, outside of what the current tariff processes allow? So that's going to be something that I think, it's going to be addressed two places, both here, but also within the deliverability framework, because it's both a technical solution as well as a policy solution. So we recognize that, and we'll be, thinking it's important that we discuss it within this process as well.
Thanks, Bob. All right, Caitlin, I'll direct it your way for online.
All right. We did have a chat question from Jason Buren with Grid Store, just wanting to add that understanding the causes of delay progress seems critical to informing solutions. Lingering is a symptom of potentially multiple causes, and identifying the key reasons why in a way that gets IC Candor anonymously should be really helpful for identifying appropriate solutions. And then on the audio line, we have Xiao Ping Zhang with RWE. Go ahead.
Paul, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Hey, this is Xiaoping from RW. I just want to contribute one comment regarding Susan's last point on how to verify or examine the developer's intention to bring a project to COD. I think maybe there's a few things that CAISO could consider, like if a developer is being in the market for 10 years from cluster 5 to all the way to cluster 15, and they never have a COD project. Or like in the end of project, you have to work a lot for market operation and have those items set up to make your project commercialized. So I think there are a few things that CAISO could consider, like that if this company ever registered as schedule coordinator, either they contract others to manage their project or their self-schedule coordinator to manage their projects. I think those things that can be found available data in CAISO that can be used for, to evaluate if this developer is seriously into bring a project into COD. So I think also just for that comments, does CAISO consider that from the very first beginning, if you know someone is seriously to bring a project into COD, would you give that developer a better, higher priority to take the intake of the interconnection request? And I think just some of my observation, I'm sure that there are different companies, they may need to optimize their portfolio to sell some project to other developers. That does happen, but I think there are some things that CAISO could look into the history of that developer in the past 10 years to determine some sort of intention, what the developer is doing in this market. That's just my personal opinion. Thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you, Zeping.
All right, that's all we have online for now.
All right, great, thank you.
Hey.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks, Jason. Good morning. Fernando Cornell with Southern California Edison. Just wanted to, on the questions and the follow-ups that are taking place here, and I think Danielle's scribe on this, on the deliverability issue or deliverability, the PPA is not always an indication of viability. Can we scroll down a bit on this, what we see on the screen, please? PPAs are not the only measures of viability. I would propose that PPAs are not always an indication of viability. There might be times when some entities are a little bit more aggressive or diligent in trying to pursue a PPA, but they could still be viable. So I would recommend or suggest that that wording be changed. Thank you.
All right, I'm not seeing any other hands up. So let's, for the sake of continuing the conversation and focusing back on the problem statement and honing in on the wording of the statement, can we just quickly go to the top of the first table, sorry, the very last table. I just want to reflect that, yeah, keep going, yeah. One more table down. Yep. So, you know, in the same vein of how Bob presented the stakeholder feedback yesterday, I don't know that we need to hit every single point here, but let's just leave it on the screen for a moment, let people absorb what some of the stakeholders said. There was a lot of, just to share how we came to this simple conclusion in some of the one-lines, there was a lot of good feedback. Some of it was specific to the problem statement, which is what I tried to pull out and hone in on here. Some of it was specific to solutions, and we saw a lot of good feedback specific to modifications, specific to suspensions, and other topics that were proposed as part of the solution aspect. So just tried to pull out some of the specific problem statement notes here. So some of the key things I think that I saw here was the focus on and being careful with, again, the words, right? So we used in the problem statement many, as expected, and viable. I think that's a good point, to be careful of how we use those words if they're not clearly defined. And we saw some of the red lines above in the generally proposed. You know, we had a couple of stakeholders talk about projects lingering in the queue. San Diego said, you know, consider tangible actions to address the less viable projects. Again, we get into that viable word and how to address that. Scroll down just a hair if you don't mind. Yeah, and, you know, just kind of reiterating what we've already discussed, but, you know, talking about adopt more stringent requirements for pre and post GIA or contract execution, either proceed towards commercial operation or withdraw, or terminate them in some way, shape, or form. And then I guess, again, identify the impacts of non-viable projects on the remainder of the queue. So what are those projects? If those projects or a list of projects are lingering that we could somehow define, by those projects lingering, how are they impacting the other projects that are in the queue, whether it's upgrades being assigned, cost responsibilities, whatever the case might be. I'm not seeing, oh, Rayanne does have her hand up. Yeah, Rayanne, go ahead.
Thanks, Jason. Rayanne Quadro, Gridwell Consulting. I'm just thinking, you know, as I do my analysis and consider my comments for the next round here, it would be helpful to have the more detailed queue transparency information that we talked about from our last IPE. I know that that's something that Debbie has in the pipeline with IT, but the more I look at some of these projects that we're thinking have been in the queue for too long, so on and so forth, I'm aware that many of them are partially online. And so, you know, it might be a 350 megawatt project, but I know it's got 2 out of 3 phases online. And so if we could get that granularity published externally on a timeline that supports, perhaps not my next set of comments, but, you know, this IPE effort, I think we could, you know, have more meaningful analysis. I know that's something that is difficult, you know, there's workload priorities, but I think that's data that would be helpful.
Yeah, Rand, I could share that that's in process. We're currently going through the RINs, BRQ, and development process to develop that public report that's similar to the Q report, but more based on resource ID than just project specific. So then we can sort of do that analysis to see what level of, or how many megawatts, and yeah, I guess how many megawatts are online relative to a specific queue position.
I want to push back a little harder and say that I know that if you're going through the BRQ process, you're like at least 4 months from deployment of that.
I'm not saying it's going to be fast.
And that is not going to be a timeline that's going to work for supporting this effort. So
I hear you loud
if we
and
get
clear.
something out manually, at least that says this project is partially online, and the last time it declared COD for a resource ID was X date, that would be, you know, a huge data point so we could further refine our analysis.
We'll see what we can do, yeah.
Thank you.
I hear you, I hear you.
This is on topic. I want to respond directly to what Ryan's raising, if that's okay.
Quickly, yeah.
Okay. Another really good example, and I'll just do, so one of our projects that achieved commercial operations already is still in the public queue when I pulled it down again this morning. And I'm hoping some of those BRQs include adding that it's not in, like if you want to maintain it in a queue, maybe you need to flag it as in NRI or something. Because when you pull this, that's another thing. It looks like there's a lot of projects, but how many of them are actually not just executed agreements, but they're like modeled. They're in the FNM. and so I should be able to filter those out. That is a huge, that would be a very nice thing. I still think it's funny. We successfully achieved commercial operations. I still see it. They've got to figure out a way. It's been over almost a month. So I'm also not sure how frequently the public queue is getting updates if we're that far flagged.
Okay, yep, thank you. All right, let's go online really quick.
Okay, we have 2 hands up online, so let's start with Susan Schneider. Oh, looks like she put her hand down. So let's move to Ryan Millard. Susan, if you do want to ask your question, just re-raise your hand. So Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Ryan from Nextera. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hey Ryan.
So I feel like in the process of discussing the problem, we're kind of leaching into the why a problem does or doesn't exist, and that's prompting this mix of solutions, which I'm seeing on the screen. Do we really need to go into this much detail on identifying the why a problem exists, or is that going to be part of the next workshop where we're starting to talk about the problem in more depth and then start talking about solutions, where I imagine a lot of folks are potentially going to have opinions on why that solution doesn't address the problem or why a problem exists in the first place?
I would say, so we entered into this discussion on the why space for the purpose of trying to define why we're having this discussion, why we're talking about it, why we're trying to raise it as 1, a principle, and 2, a second problem statement. So I do agree with your sentiment that we are sort of diving into the whys and which is leading us to sort of the solution space here, but I think we've had a healthy conversation where we can now revert it back to, let's go back to the problem statement and hone in on what it is that we're trying to solve, and then get into the why and continue that conversation later.
So are you trying to upfront identify all of the whys now? Is that the goal here? I'm just trying to get a clarification on how much depth we need to get into.
Yeah, not specifically. I would say, I think we could beat ourselves up trying to hit all of the whys and identify all of the bullet points. The questions that came to us when we first put out the discussion paper and through that first stakeholder discussion was, why are we discussing the way we manage the queue, and how do we manage those projects that are currently in the queue? And we even discussed yesterday, and we sort of struggled with the principle statement, and stakeholders were questioning, well, why are we discussing this? We need to know more details, and what's the problem within the details that's causing us to raise it to this principle level and problem statement level. And so I think we've hit a number of whys. The ISO has shared sort of their pain points. We saw some pain points from customers, stakeholders, developers, and the community. I think we now can circle back to that problem statement, and let's hone in on that a little bit. And then we can continue the why. I certainly don't want to stop there, but I think we can continue the whys and how to solve those whys in the solution space.
Yeah, I think that's my point, is that we're not going to be able to identify in detail all of the whys. I think that's a continuing conversation. So I just want to clarification on that front.
Yep.
So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan.
So Jason, is it a good time for a break, or where's a good stopping
I think
point?
it is, yeah. Is there anybody else online that had questions or other comments?
Yeah, we had Susan Schneider. She had her hand up, but that came back up.
Hi, this is Susan. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened there. It's just a very, very small nit, and I apologize even for bringing it up. But there was sort of a misdocumentation of under the causes of delay above about the PPA, where the statement that was recorded was a PPA is not necessarily an indication of viability. What I really said was the lack of a PPA doesn't mean the project isn't viable. So that a PPA is not the only measure of viability, or you can put it in a couple of different ways, but I didn't say if you had a PPA, it didn't mean you weren't viable. That, yeah, that basically, if you don't have a PPA, it doesn't mean you're not viable. So that's, I just think it's an important distinction, and if you're looking at measures of viability, you know, there needs to be some other alternative besides a PPA to demonstrate it. So that's all I meant to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Susan. All right. Let's take a quick pause. Let's do we want to do a 10-minute break?
Yeah, quarter till. Come back at quarter till.
So yeah, let's come back at 10:45 and we'll reconvene.
All right, everybody online, welcome back. We'll give it a few minutes while people get situated in the meeting room.
All right, for the folks on the line, we're just getting seated again. We'll get started in about 60 seconds.
Can they hear us online?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. All right. So far, so good. I think we're doing good on time. Thank you, Jason. So just a couple of things that I wanted to make note of. I do have to leave at 11 for some travel, but I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for super collaborative discussion and just a great level of engagement. And so I look forward to the future meetings and getting to a solution. So looking forward to having all of you on that journey with us. Some of you have mentioned that July 11th would be a great opportunity to meet in person again. So we are looking at trying to arrange that meeting to be in person. We may not have a confirmation before the end of today's meeting, so stay tuned. But we have some rooms we're juggling here in the public wing of the ISO because there's some remodeling going on. So we're going to try to make it happen and do it in person on July 11th. Okay. The other thing I wanted to mention is wanted to thank Jared from the CPUC for joining us today in person. And we've had a sort of sidebar conversation with Jared, and he's graciously offered to do a presentation on July 11th to talk about sort of the CPUC processes and how they interconnect with the ISO in terms of our processes. So I think that'll be very helpful. So we'll plan that in the agenda for July 11th. So thanks, Jared, for offering that. So with that, continue. Jason, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Joanne. All right. Let's dive right back in. So for the sake of time, we only have about an hour and 10 minutes total left until we convene, and we want to leave a little bit of time at the end to just sort of summarize and set expectations for next steps. So let's jump back up into the problem statement number 2. In preparation of this meeting and, seeing the stakeholder feedback, made some, I guess, presupposed red lines to the statement, but let's dive in and I want to hear, or we'd like to hear feedback on, does this meet everything we just discussed? Does it satisfy all of the problems that we have? And if not, what other problems do we need to include in here?
We don't have anything online at this moment either.
Okay, thanks, Caitlin. Rayanne, go ahead.
Can we unpack the second sentence? This is from like an English standpoint, not from a substantive standpoint. The current process for managing the queue limits the efficiency of the development process. Do the queue processes really limit the efficiency of the development process? I mean,
I'd like to hear developers answer that. If I had an answer from the ISO,
process takes a long time to get through,
Yep.
and I'll just lobby you publicly that like a proposal to extremely streamline it that I'd like to present on in July.
Sure. Yeah, I think you hit the point, right? So, what processes does the ISO manage that are causing inefficiencies in project development, right? Modification requests and the timeline to submit the data, validate the data, do the study, get you the results can take very significant amount of time sometimes, right? And how can we streamline that? Same with limited operation studies, right? Not to get into solutions, but we made that distinct proposal to increase the time frame to give stakeholders or developers more time in the LOS process. But how can we refine them? So that's what that's intended to look at. And it's not limited to modifications in LOS, right? We can dive in and get into more detail, the et ceteras.
And then I just wonder also, agreeing that certainly there's opportunity for streamlining there. The second clause in that sentence, and a number of projects remain in the queue, should that be a separate statement altogether? Because it's not really related to the fact necessarily that it's because those processes are cumbersome. Projects remain in the queue for that reason, and presumably many more.
Period. Yeah, and then move on to another statement. Sure, that's fair. So, since I'm not hearing or seeing any hands, I just kind of, the one big picture thing that I think is important to just keep in mind is it's all of the ISO's team, right? The interconnection team and the queue management team. It's our responsibility. It's our job here to help help projects come online and satisfy our policy goals, our resource goals, our state goals, whatever the goals, that's our responsibility, right? It's also our responsibility to help identify the projects that aren't helping us get there and figure out a way to get them out of the way so that those projects that are moving forward can. And that's really the ultimate goal here is we've come across some items and problems where we are having a hard time identifying those projects that aren't helping achieve those goals, and we are trying to figure out how to get them out of the way. Caitlin, is there anybody online? Any comments?
No, no one online. Again, for folks online, you can use the raise hand icon at the bottom right of the window, or throw something into the chat and I can read it aloud for you.
At the risk of complicating this conversation, I don't see, this is Danielle from the ISO. I don't see anything in this problem statement that gets to the point that you just made, which is the implication of projects sitting in the queue on other projects that can move forward. And I don't know if that's something that needs to be called out or not. But you know, if there is a project that is not going to move forward or does not appear to be move forward, what are the impacts to the projects that are behind it?
Fair point. Would that be a natural conclusion or solution? If we solve the problems ahead, it sort of organically then solves the problem of impacts to other projects. I'm not disagreeing with your point, but yeah, does fixing the problem solve that impact to other projects? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just thinking about defining the problem too, because it seems like from a developer perspective, that may be a problem for you if there are other projects that are sort of holding your project up.
Okay, so you're saying because of this problem, it's also impacting potentially other projects as well. So we could add that in. Yeah, I think that's a good point.
And I think that's something I invite feedback on too from stakeholders who are actually, are you experiencing that? And is that something that needs to be part of the problem statement?
Is there a way to quantify that, to add to that question? Rayanne, go ahead.
Rayanne Quadro, Gridwell Consulting. I definitely want to endorse that statement. In historic IPE efforts, you know, we've implemented controls that's like, okay, well, how do we make sure that projects don't impact other projects? Meaning, if you have shared network upgrades, you have to continue paying for them, so on and so forth. But I think developing a comprehensive list of all of the impacts and acknowledging at this point with our superclusters that administrative burden, where historically it hasn't sort of been a reason, might be a legitimate concern at this point. You know, when our largest cluster was 150 projects, we could surmount that, but 530, perhaps not. So having a comprehensive list, as you're suggesting, Danielle, of how interconnection requests and active projects can impact others, and whether the only control for that impact is withdraw, would be helpful for evaluating those proposals.
Yeah. Thank you, Rand. Kathleen?
Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I think it makes sense to flag it. The way that this has been a worry of mine as a result of fixing the problem is how I think about it more so. If we fix the problem that there's some stale projects and incent them to withdraw, and we've right-sized our queue, we use all the buzzwords, right-sized our queue, sure. Then there are some potential implications and adverse outcomes that we need to work through. But I've thought about it as more as the fallout of fixing the problem.
Yeah.
There probably is a way, and it would be helpful if you could do a little digging into this. So what comes to mind for me is like the precursor network upgrades. Like I just don't have myself like a great sense of how many PNUs are potentially could change, like what is the actual domino effect of some of these projects that you're thinking about. And I think that, you know, I think it's a function of the size, right? So maybe in a certain cluster, because we do a cluster study, so maybe if it's only one project, it's not gonna, and we're well past the network upgrade already coming to service, that's not a big deal. But maybe there are some clusters that are closer in time to our current ones, and the network upgrades they're not in service yet, and there's a large amount of projects that kind of are fitting the fact pattern that we're talking about. That's where I've been having a little anxiety as I think through it, but I don't have any solutions. I just have some concerns with what might happen for the projects that are considered viable move forward.
Okay, noted.
We do have a hand raised and a comment in the chat, Jason.
All right, yeah, go ahead, Caitlin.
All right. First in the chat, we had a note from Virginia Thompson with Next Era Energy Resources. Clearing lingering projects out of the queue is a three-party effort. All parties need to be held accountable to meeting timelines. The issue is sometimes with the project itself, and at other times with the PTO, for example, in performing upgrades, and at times to respond to the interconnection customer. And then Susan Schneider has her hand raised. So Susan, go ahead.
I just wanted to, and I don't want to get too into a solution thing, but as far as upgrades, I think a lot of some reason at least that projects are lingering is because the timeline for the upgrades keeps changing. And I think in particular, which projects can come online before upgrades are done. And I know you've got the limited operations study you've pushed back, but you know, I think in particular, CRASs seem to be a big issue where the timeline just moves all over the place and continually, usually in the wrong direction, but then sometimes projects come online before the CRAS, sometimes they can't. And the issues of the communication around delays, I think, is also an issue. Not that the delays themselves are difficult, but if the communication around the delays could be better, that would at least help in the planning of the of people trying to figure out when they could actually get online. So I'm just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, thank you, Susan.
And the timelines keep changing, and the communication seems either informal or inconsistent or something like that.
That's all we have online at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Oh, Aisha, go ahead.
Aisha Bari from Recurrent Energy. Jason, we spent some time on understanding viability in this section. So I was curious if the need to redefine viability for projects in the queue and for cluster comes in this category, is part of the problem statement, or we will discuss that in solutions section.
I don't think we should define viability in the problem statement specifically. I don't think we want to get...
I mean the need to define viability.
The need to define viability.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Bob, did you...
Yeah, I will just, this is Bob Emmert with the ISO. I'll just say that is within the problem statement for problem statement 1, but that's for projects coming into the queue. I think it's, just as viable for, we need a better definition of viability for projects that have completed their studies.
Yep. Or as you're proceeding to commercial operation, what does that viability look like along that scale? Certainly I think we can add an element to that. Thank you. All right. Not hearing anything. I'm going to put it on mute for just 1 second and convene with Danielle and Bob really quick on just how we want to handle next steps. So I'm going to go silent for just 1 moment, and I'll be right back. Okay, we're back. We convened, and we're good. So, Bob, go ahead.
So I have a question that I've been debating asking, and everybody thinks I should, so I will. I'm going to ask, this is a very obvious statement. There's a tension in this process of queue management between projects that have gone through the study process, they've been there for a while, they've invested a lot of time and money and still have hopes, and they're marketing their project. Maybe they failed a number of times, but they're just not ready to give up. So that's one side of the coin. The other side is new projects coming in. Well, let me just say, in that first project, it's got some upgrades that later projects need. So now you've got some new projects coming in, and they're wanting to move forward very quickly, and they see the first project as being a hindrance to them. So there's a tension between both projects have rights to some extent. You've got the old project, hey, they've been in this for a while. They've got a lot of skin in the game, if you will. And new projects are saying, yeah, but they're not moving forward, and they're hindering my project. So there's this tension, and I'm wondering, as you all as stakeholders and developers, are you willing to try to define, maybe a line within that process of saying, here's where that line gets crossed, to where a project that does have rights, because they've been around and they've spent a lot of money and so forth, but they've kind of crossed this line now, to where now they are, in some form of a definition, no longer viable to the extent that they're hindering newer projects. Is that an issue that should be in the problem statement, and is that something that you all stakeholders are willing to grapple with?
Rayanne Quadro, Gridwell Consulting. Tale as old as time, right, Bob? But I think there is where I'd really like to see, again, my pitch for that detailed data. There is a big difference between a 400 megawatt project that has 250 megawatts online, is in service and ready to build out the remainder of its project as soon as it gets a PPA, and a 400 megawatt project in the transition cluster, been in the queue for 12 years at that point, who hasn't brought any megawatts online and is just either hoping for a PPA or frankly hoping to get picked up by another developer. They're just holding on to that resource because they're not developers, they're just interconnection request submitters. And so getting to that point, understanding, the sort of nuanced characteristics of those projects that are higher queued, which ones are partially online, so on and so forth, would really help inform developing an opinion on something like that. We could all speculate, but I think there are objective answers here if we can see that data.
Yeah, this is Bob. Just to speak to that a bit, you've touched on kind of our problem with that is the answer can be, it depends. Give me the facts for this project.
But you have the privilege of knowing which ones are partially online, and I don't.
Right, and that's data, but that all comes into the process of, maybe at a higher level, we need to make some determinations. And, hopefully the specific facts of each project are not so detailed and specific that we can't deal with it, because every project and situation is so unique that we can't write up tariff or BPM language to address it. But
I'll also make a second pitch that I don't think it's a hard and fast timeline situation. I think, if there's a line in the sand, it's probably not 7 years, and that, if we know anything from the 400 material modification letters your group has sent out, right, Jason, that every project is unique. And so, you are probably not going to be able to create a binary filter that's every project who does or does not meet this characteristic is or is not viable. It's going to have to be some sort of scoring mechanism similar to what you have with TPD allocation to understand, the likelihood of viability instead of is or is not viable.
Sure.
We do have Ryan Millard on the line.
Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
You okay?
Yes.
I'll keep this pretty brief because I think it was a really simple but pretty fundamental question, and that's, if you let everyone in the world into the queue, you wonder why the queue's so big. So I think while it's contentious, I think it's absolutely a discussion that we need to have, and I think in our discussion about what constitutes viability, which will start to flush some of this out in our solution set and begin identifying some of the criteria or scoring, if you will, of those projects. So yes, it's contentious, but I think it needs to happen if we want to see some demonstrable change here.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. All right, I'll throw out a final thoughts question on the revised or updated problem statement number 2 here. We'll take back the question of what does it mean to be viable and add an element later. All right, not hearing anything. Danielle, do you want to take us through the finish line here? All right. Before I give up the mic, I just want to say thank you to the team who has helped us get us to this point and spending a lot of time setting this up, kind of echoing what Bob said earlier. Joanne left already, but Falim, thank you for being here. Jeff, Yelena stepped out. Oh, nope, she's over here. Danielle, Bob, thanks for co-hosting this. Much appreciated. I think we made great progress here. Caitlin on the line, thank you for hosting us online, and of course to our event host for being here and tagging along with us. So, Danielle?
All right, so we're in the home stretch. We do have some revised principles that we'll talk through a little bit. And then, actually, I think while Jason is pulling those up, this conversation has been really helpful for all of us today, as Jason and Bob and Joanne have all mentioned. So thank you for being here. We were thinking about the next working group, which is on Tuesday, the 27th, less than a week away now. And I think initially we had been thinking that we would get through the problem statements and the principles today and then move into solutions and proposals next week and maybe start with the ISO presenting what we had in the discussion paper. But just some of these conversations over the last day and a half have been, have kind of exposed some areas that may require additional discussion before we jump into those proposals. So we're thinking of using some of that time to first kind of do a final check and clean up of the principles and problem statements. Hopefully that won't take long. We'll put them up for you to review in the next couple of days as well. But then have some conversations just high level around viability. What does viability look like? We can put things on the board, we can brainstorm, we can vote, but think about viability both in terms of incoming projects and projects in the queue, because I think we've heard that as a theme and kind of maybe a area where we don't all have alignment, but we all agree that it needs a little bit more definition. And then the other thing we might want to talk about, and we're open to additional suggestions too, so think about it in the next 40 minutes, is data needs, and if there's more information or ways of sharing information that we can provide to you that will help facilitate discussion. I think we have a list going already, but if there are more things that you all want to talk about on Tuesday, we can do that. Are there any other ideas of topics for discussion next Tuesday before we start jumping into like meaty proposals? Yeah, Jasmine.
I just have a quick question. So next Tuesday, part of it's going to be finalizing the principles, discussing viability and data transparency needs. And will the latter half of the day be like solutions oriented, or is that the following workshop?
Yeah, we can start to jump into it. I think we're open to your feedback on that. So think about it. I don't know if you have a thought on that right now, but I think at least maybe a half day, just kind of talking through viability and data needs makes sense, or a couple hours, and then we can start jumping into proposals that you all have had a little bit of time to digest, and then we can talk about, we can address additional proposals at the next working group on the 11th from all of you, so that you have time to kind of prepare them and bring them to the working group.
Okay, thank you.
We do have a question on the line from Ryan Millett. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, this is Ryan. I just want to do a quick audio check. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. So you probably already thought about this, but I want to throw it out there because I've heard rumblings from other stakeholders that haven't raised it, but I think a lot of folks are talking about it. I think we'd encourage the CAISO to schedule the whole initiative timeline with target dates inclusive of working groups, the straw proposal, any revised proposal, the final proposal, and board approval. You've only scheduled out to July 11th, and I think that might be a little problematic to do this incrementally. You can always adjust the agenda based on the progress we're making in the working groups, and we recognize that the dates can move, but in the absence of a more comprehensive milestone timeline, it's going to be difficult to keep things on the right trajectory and allow us to prepare our SMEs internally on these topics. So I'm hoping you can take that back, think about what makes the most sense, but we really need to see a more comprehensive timeline versus just these kind of iterative working groups that are scheduled a couple weeks out. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's helpful. We have heard that, and we will try to provide that for you by Tuesday, if not sooner. High level, we had planned to use these 3 working groups to sort of inform development of a straw proposal, and then go from there on, you know, how many more working groups are scheduled, but understand that the sort of week in advance working group scheduling isn't working for stakeholders, especially in the summer. I know it's hard, so we hear that, and we will try to get you something more specific and defined.
And Ms. Bob Rambert, I will say, though, that we do plan still to take this to the board in December. That's our current plan. Now, we've heard stakeholder comment that let's not rush this, let's get it right. So that's going to play into that, and it's possible we could delay, but currently that's our plan. The points in between here and there, because we've kind of got into a new process. We originally had a full-blown schedule defined, but as we got into the working group process, it became kind of squishy, if you will, and so we're kind of trying to figure out exactly how this is all going to play out. So we weren't ready to provide a schedule that people would then think, okay, well, you're off schedule now, because we're having to play it a little bit by ear at this point.
I appreciate that, and I recognize we're very supportive and appreciate, you know, and it is an aggressive timeline, and we think it needs to be. And I appreciate your point, but I also think that if things move, people just need to recognize that it's based off of the progress that you're making in those working groups. So if a timeline needs to change, it happens. It already happens in you know, an existing process without the working groups. But setting something out there, noting that it's tentative, but this is kind of what we're targeting, I think goes a long way. You did it with the EDAM, and I think that's, you know, a great example of how and why that was successful, and I think we can do it here.
And we did have a comment in the chat from Bo Paczynski with Diamond Generating Corporation. Interconnection queue growth has mostly been a result of CPUC IRP projections of the electrical generation requirements to transition California toward a net zero economy. What did not happen was for transmission to be planned and implemented to accommodate the conversion to the net zero generation system. Generation needed deliverability to address RA and capacity needs, which required transmission to be implemented ahead of generation. But that's all we have online.
Okay, thanks. And I saw also some questions on the chat about the format of the next meeting. Next Tuesday is virtual only. As Joanne mentioned earlier, we're working on getting a hybrid option or in-person option for the July 11th workshop, but we haven't confirmed that yet. So we'll put out a notice and make sure you're all aware of that. But I think I may have confused things when I said we do whiteboarding and stuff like that, because we'll be virtual. So virtual whiteboards.
We did have a hand raised just now by Susan Schneider. Let's move to Susan.
Hi, I apologize if this was covered somewhere else, but it would be good to know if you want people to give presentations. Is that the next workshop or the one after, or what? You know, those obviously have to be prepared, so it'd be good to know what you have in mind for agendas.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Susan. Roughly for agendas, what we have in mind is that anyone who wants to present a new proposal or a modification of one of the concepts we've already talked about would have an opportunity to do that on the 11th, July 11th workshop. That's another reason it would be good to be in person. Hopefully that gives you time between now and then with a pretty solid understanding of what the principles and problem statements are to craft your proposal to fit within those. If we need more time to go through the number of proposals that people want to present, we will definitely consider that. We want to continue the good progress that this group is doing. So we'll put that out when we put out the more specific information on the schedule for work groups and going forward. Any other questions on next steps? Okay. Oh, Aisha, sorry.
Hi, Aisha from Recurrent. 2 requests. Let's keep the schedule for cluster 15 as part of the, when in the workshop series we discuss that, because we probably want to have that also as part of the December board filing, right?
So just to be sure I understand your question, are you saying keep that kind of as part of the deadline for getting this?
Not this, but like cluster 15, when do the phase 1 studies kick off?
Yeah.
When they are likely to complete and resolve those things. As developers, we are constantly getting asked questions on just, especially when you go to buy land or do options agreement, there is that question on how long those agreements need to be. So it's really helpful to know those timelines of when we will have the first check of phase 1 study results. Okay.
This is Bob Emery. That's going to be what the solution comes out of this whole process to problem statement 1. So, so that's kind of, again, another tension that we're dealing with is get this done as quickly as possible. The plan was to get it to the board in December so that we could get cluster 15 back on track and determining with whatever process we're using that we get the projects moving through and moving forward versus, okay, if it just takes longer than we anticipated to, as you might say, get it right. If it takes longer, that does push cluster 15 back further. So that's kind of the issue that we're dealing with here.
Thanks for that, Bob. I'll still stand by my statement. The second one is, maybe for some it's clear, but not for all it's clear. Like when we see those transmission capacity zone, when we see that map, and when we see the IRP, how are we supposed to process those numbers in terms of what that means for available capacity for cluster 15? Or how do those numbers, are those numbers for cluster 13, 14, 15? Like maybe some clarity on how to interpret those numbers, how to link them with the cluster megawatts that are seeking will be helpful. And we should include that as one of the agenda items for the workshop.
Yeah, that sounds good. That's a good idea. Jeff, do you want to say anything about that now, or do you want to wait?
Yeah, no, we can. That's something we can look at as to how do you translate and the transmission plan identifies the zones. There's the single line diagrams that show in Chapter 3 and in Appendix F the transmission areas, in particular what the portfolio is. You have to manually kind of look at what is in the queue to what is in the mapping based upon the POI, and that can be done. Cluster 15 with the volume, we haven't got to that stage yet, so.
Yeah, I think like for me the question is, does this apply to just cluster 15, or are we also all of that capacity will be is saved for all the clusters? Mm-hmm. Like because if it's just cluster 15, the dropout rate will be probably less worse than if that entire capacity is actually going to be shared between all the clusters.
I'm not sure what you mean by shared between the clusters.
Well, let me speak to that. So it's kind of two things. One is you've got the allocation process. So all projects that are still eligible to seek an allocation can seek that capacity. And then what we're trying to develop here for cluster 15 going forward is the priority for determining which projects get studied in a more higher priority level based on their seeking interconnection to locations that have that capacity. So you've got those two things. So that capacity is going to be kind of the signal of, where we want to make sure that we give the highest priority to ready projects seeking interconnection where we already have planned capacity for, because that'll bring the capacity online more quickly, because those transmission upgrades are either there or planned and moving forward. And then the other side is obviously the allocation process, and as long as you're eligible to seek an allocation, that capacity is available to be had for those projects that meet the criteria.
On that same point, I know the one missing piece when we see the TPD numbers is how much is contracted behind those numbers and how much is not online yet. And nobody has had a good handle on that. I think there's some information in the portfolio in the baseline resource assumptions, and now we see some resources that are, I think there's another tier added to that, which is contracted resources but not online. But there is a lag between those. Maybe the three agencies, is there a way to work and on a zonal basis give that information, because it's confidential?
Well, I think what you're talking about is, one of the problem statement points is having the data. It's even in the foundational items. So that's going to be something that's going to be discussed. So, when we talk about data, it's not just looking at the queue, it's all this information that we need to work towards. So as we get into the solutions of what it means to meet that actual foundational component, what does that look like? And it'll be open to all that.
Okay, any more questions? All right. So we did take a stab at revising the principles based on the conversation yesterday. Some of these have not been revised since the conversation we had 10 minutes ago, but I think we can work through that. So I'm gonna kind of take these one by one again. We've got a half hour to do this and still open to some thoughts. I saw one grimace in the crowd already. First one is prioritizing interconnections in zones where transmission capacity exists or new transmission has been approved. That's pretty similar to the initial problem statement that was proposed. But then there was this concern that we heard yesterday that prioritize might kind of foreclose any opportunity to find new points of interconnection or new upgrades. So we added this clause, and it was originally 1A yesterday, but we added this clause while still providing opportunities to identify and provide alternative points of interconnection or upgrades. The goal here is to be clear that we're still prioritizing interconnections in those zones, but that we are not closing any door to new opportunities that may be outside of those. Kathleen?
Just a quick clarification question. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. So that includes, the clause includes additional scale in those zones as well? Just want to clarify that when we are understanding the law providing opportunities to identify and provide alternative points of interconnection, it does sound like outside of zones or upgrades to facilitate increased interconnections inside a zone, that they're both included.
Okay, yeah, I think it reads that way. Okay, I got a double thumbs up for those of you on the phone. Okay, any other questions or concerns? Okay, so the second one that we talked about, this was changed pretty significantly, actually. If you recall, this is initially about the volume of interconnection requests or the volume of megawatts that we were receiving. I think when a subgroup met on this over lunch, they lifted it up significantly to just read, ensuring meaningful study results that take into account system capability, state resource planning, and procurement. And we are clarifying that state resource planning includes both the CEC and the CPUC resource planning. So I know we had heard some concerns from non-CPUC jurisdictional LSEs that they wanted to make sure they were included in this, so that's spelled out here. All right. Any comments on the phone? No, not at this time. All right. The third one is, this has not changed significantly at all. I think we struck one acronym. So it's now aligning interconnection, that we seek to align interconnection and transmission plan deliverability processes with resource procurement functions. I think all we took out there was LSE, resource procurement functions. So it's a little bit broader. I wonder if we just wore you all down. It worked. Yeah. All right. The fourth is, and we haven't really revisited this, so this is what we just talked about. We agreed yesterday to sort of park this fourth principle until we talked about the problem statement on queue management, which I think we have a much clearer sense of what the issues are, and it sounds like there is an agreement, at least within the stakeholder group and the ISO, that we should be looking at post-study queue management procedures. So that's what this principle is intended to just clarify. It reads, improve the post-study queue management procedures to enable advancement of projects. Yes,
yeah,
Jason?
This is Jason with the ISO. I'll jump in here. The element that we did remove, at least from what we're seeing on the screen here, is, and I'll just read it, including the modification request and other processes and project accountability, right? That addition sort of narrows our focus, I think, and thus the reason we removed it. With this revised element, right, we've left the door wide open to any processes or procedures or elements that fall within that queue management or project development space, right? Not just queue management, but contract development, queue management, potentially new resource implementation processes and those types of elements as well. So I think that's why we removed that latter half. If we want to narrow the focus, we certainly can, but we want to leave it open as well. Kathleen, Rayanne, you're good? Okay, Kathleen, go ahead.
Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Two very narrow suggestions. I would suggest removing post-study, just simple, improve the queue management procedures. That way we're not overly narrowing there as well. I'd also, my second suggestion would be, so in my mind, based on our discussion this morning, which was very helpful, the principle that I would recommend is improve the queue management procedures to result in a right-sized queue that enables advancement of viable projects.
Just about, so number one, the first item you talked about, not post-study, that seems to be what we'll be working through for what is the new process that we're going to have. So I don't want to necessarily put it in this part when it's going to be covered in in problem statement 1. We're going to be dealing with the full study process, so we shouldn't need queue management components to try to mess with what we try to deal with problem statement 1. And then, so it should be covered in that. And if we shouldn't need any post-processing tariff language to deal with what's within the study process.
And I would just fully respect that. That feels very solution-oriented. Where I'm coming with the principle suggestion is just this is an overarching principle that would apply across both problem statement 1 and problem statement 2. Is just how I've understood the exercise. So I'm not prejudging which problem statement this principle impacts, just suggesting that it is an overarching principle that we're trying to right-size the queue through our procedures so that we can facilitate the advancement of projects that are going to achieve commercial operations. But I 100% hear what you're saying, Bob, just differentiating between the principle and problem statement.
Yeah.
Question, general question, should we include the word contracting and queue management? Right, we've talked a lot about GIA negotiations and execution. Would that help expand the procedures we're looking at. Yes, Ryan?
I think it might be worthwhile to have some data provided between now and then, or maybe at the next meeting, from Chris Sibley's department on how the 2018 IPE reforms for GIA execution ultimately helped or hindered the process. The way I understand it right now, the deadline for executing your GIA is in time for your longest lead network upgrade that affects other customers. So it's not so much a deadline like within 6 months of your phase 2 study result, but based specifically on the construction needs of the network upgrades associated to your generators. And that was a complicated math to put together and is sometimes difficult to understand. So potentially is simplifying that a better idea? You know, has that helped or hurt or been a neutral policy for them?
I hear you loud and clear. I think talking principle statement-wise, adding contracting in gets us to problem-solving that question of, you know, what level of data do we have and how are we progressing towards that. So, yep, hear you loud and clear.
This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I just wanted to add, and maybe, and ask, honestly, just ask a clarifying question. Because in my mind, I guess I'm including, when I see queue management procedures, I'm thinking about the parking rules as well, and maybe maybe that's not the right place to think about them, but that's, so when I'm kind of emphasizing, well, there's also study, like intra-study process, I'm thinking about parking. And I'm thinking about, so how many years can you park? You get 2 attempts, but for the 3rd attempt, I find it very squishy. I don't really understand exactly, and I think it's not super transparent. What gets you that 3rd? How do you have faith that there is that deliverability available? So I think that it is a scope item that I've thought of as queue management procedure and rather than interconnection, and I thought I'd just add that very clear call out because I might be cross-talking and confusing a little bit when I'm being so general. Thank you.
Can I suggest that that sounds like something that kind of fits in the discussion around the problems a little bit more than the principles.
I just wanted to give a clear example of why I was suggesting to remove post-study.
Yeah, I think.
And after the conversation, yeah, I'm okay with that. I guess I was thinking too much of the problem statement side of things, but yeah, especially when you clarify it as, you know, I consider the allocation process post-study from my perspective, but I'm okay with opening it up because that, you know, can be a principle that we can use within the study process as well, that we need to think about those things.
Yeah. I was just going to make one last, so I think, Kathleen, to your point, right, we sort of narrowed it down, and the words queue management procedures don't necessarily encompass all. So what if it was procedures for projects proceeding to commercial operation, right? So that sort of encompasses the tail end of the study process and everything that gets you to commercial operations. We'll revise it. Thank you for the feedback, yeah.
Thanks. I wanted to go back. I don't see everything come up in the chat, but I did see one statement come up on principle number 2, and a concern that just mentioning CEC may not actually address the needs of non-CPUC jurisdictional POUs, and I didn't see the entire comment, so I don't know, Caitlin, if you can read that, and then we can try to respond in real time.
Yeah. So this is from Jane Luckhart with NCPA. Adding CEC to number 2 does not address POU resource planning. It will need additional refinement. So Jane, I know you might be having technical difficulties with your audio, so feel free to respond or add detail in the chat, and I can read it aloud for you.
Yeah, and we can also follow up offline. That is, the intent is definitely to include POU planning on this, so if there's a better way to say that, we're more than open to revising. I don't think anyone has expressed any concerns with that in the room, so I think we can do whatever it takes to make that work. Okay, and then we have 2 additional principle statements that were suggested by stakeholders, which we are still considering. I think the number 5 was proposed by CalCCA, and there was some discussion of it yesterday and some support for it yesterday. Several people view it as implicit, but it doesn't hurt to say. So we've added, enhance the interconnection process's ability to support the procurement necessary to meet CPUC resource portfolios and CEC SB 100 portfolios. So any concerns with adding that there? I don't think the ISO does. Okay. And then number 6 is something that the ISO is still considering, and we were also going to check and see whether this has been addressed or can be addressed in the problem statement discussion. So Rayanne and others, I'll look to you to see if you feel that this still needs to be a principle, but we will consider it if so. And that is provide public, accessible, plain language information and supporting empirical data specifically geared toward enabling the above principles. So this was in response to a number of requests that we had yesterday from stakeholders that we just improve our transparency and accessibility of the data so that we can all kind of get to the heart of the problems and find some good solutions.
Seems like more of a principle than a problem statement to me. You know, it could go either way, though. You could design it to say the problem is the data's not out there, but that seems kind of pessimistic, so leave it in the principles.
So it is, we did capture it in the notes, if not in the problem statement from yesterday, so we can turn to that as well. But we do have to make sure that we can add this, but right now it's on there, and so we'll get some feedback and send it out in a couple of days. And then do we want to recap, if there are no more comments on the principles, do you want to recap problem statement 1 as well, Bob? All right.
Thanks, everyone. Get a comment in the chat, or real quick on WebEx. Jason Bierwin, go ahead.
I just wanted to offer, I was waiting to make sure we could go through the 6 that had already been worked on. And, you know, I think these principles are about what the reforms to come will do. They don't say who will do it. And I'd like to offer that a principle should be that, you know, increasing responsibilities as a part of these reforms should be balanced across the stakeholders. Based on sort of the discussion paper, it seemed like all the requirements were going to be on interconnection customers, and I think it's worth pointing out that we should be considering requirements for interconnection customers and transmission owners and the ISO alike. You know, the FERC's proposed and pending rule on interconnection reforms includes both new requirements on interconnection customers and new requirements on transmission providers. And I encourage folks to consider that that is likely to be required by FERC at a certain point and probably should be incorporated into this process as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Are there any responses from stakeholders to that additional proposed principle of, and we don't have any language for it, but I think the concept, Jason, is a shared responsibility to make these improvements and execute on these reforms. Just looking at my colleagues from the ISO, I don't see any concerns with that. I like it. Okay, so Jason, if you can send us maybe just some language or a draft of what you just said, that'd be great, and we'll try to incorporate it. Thank you. Okay, and then before we leave, sorry, I just didn't want to forget that we did also add to the in additions. There was a joke that, do we need to say in addition, we will not do anything illegal, but in addition, we will continue to ensure open access and avoid discriminatory or preferential treatment. So we added that. It's important to say, it's important to do. And we'll all work to create reforms that result in a process that is manageable, meaningful, and sustainable to the ISO and all stakeholders. So there we just added the word meaningful in light of a lot of the conversations we had about the value of the studies that we're producing with the volume of requests that we've been getting. So I think hopefully it sounds like we're in a good place with these, and we can take some feedback in the next couple of days, informal. We're not doing a formal written comment period between these work groups, but if you have comments or thoughts, Caitlin will get you the address of where to send them, and you can always call us as well, so that we can just kind of move forward on Tuesday with these principles in mind. All right.
All right, Danielle, sounds like we're ready to close out. Oh, oh.
Not quite. And we don't really have much time to discuss this, but I would like to go ahead and project the problem statement number 1 as it now stands. So this will take just a moment. But as we discussed earlier, that we will go ahead and post a document. We've got these in separate documents right now. We'll post it as a single document so everybody can have this. And you know, as Danielle said, Caitlin will send out an email address that if people want to do and feel it's really necessary to do some final wordsmithing of these documents, that you'll have the chance to go ahead and do that by email. And our anticipation is that we'll do a final review of this at the beginning of next Tuesday's work group meeting. So, Jason, if you could just scroll down, didn't make any changes to the points from the ISO's original problem statement, but I did want to just let everybody review, and I'm not going to read through all this, but I wanted to just allow you to see this. This is the final problem/pain points that I heard from this group that I think everybody was agreeing to were appropriate to put into the problem statement. So if there's anything that someone feels like we missed or that we misrepresented some way, feel free to speak up now. If not, you'll be seeing these again as a document we'll post, and you can always email us with your thoughts. But we've only got probably 10 minutes to deal with this before we do the final wrap-up. Does anybody, and we may not need that, but want to give everybody a chance to consider this now and any final tweaks or thoughts or comments.
And if anyone online has any thoughts or comments, you can use the raise hand icon or put your note in the chat and I'll read it.
I understand there's a hand raised online.
Yeah, we just got Jason Buren from Grid Store. Go ahead.
Thank you. Something that I'm not sure if it's fully captured in these current pain points. I think that in addition to talking about construction timelines and how that affects the process, it's also important to note that the reality of energy project development involves local permitting processes, real estate acquisition and retention, other requirements, long lead time procurement sometimes. And so to the extent that these processes are out of phase with those realities, that would be a pain point. One thing I would note, for example, is that particularly long processes will tend to, for example, bias against perhaps siting near load centers and in transmission zones where land is more expensive. And so it's important to recognize there's a systematic impact in how these processes play out in terms of those developer realities.
Okay, on that, Jason, I would ask that if you could kind of put that into what you think would be an appropriate either adjustment to number 5 or number 6 problem statement, we'll take it into consideration.
I can send something by email if that's helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Kathleen?
Kathleen Colbert from Vistra, and Jason I think my comment is along the same lines, but for number 5, there's 2 things that strike me. The first one is I would include the queue timelines are increasing in this as well. So it's queue timelines, construction timelines, kind of together when I look at a viable COD, both go into it. The queue timeline, how fast can you get through, let's say, cluster 15, and what that looks like, and then cluster 16 already forecasting, right? So we start with the timelines for the queues, and then from there, the construction timeline is estimated based on what we know today. And that gives us kind of our achievable CODs. The studies help better inform if there's things we're not aware of. Not our work, but the PTO's work can also increase it, right? So I'd add the queue timeline, construction timeline. I don't know that construction timeline fully captures the PTO work. So I think of construction timeline as more on the developer side, versus the PTO work is more on transmission.
My intention was transmission.
Okay, that's helpful.
But, yeah, if you could give me your wordsmithing of this, how you think it would be more appropriately stated by email, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, I can, and I'll actually crowdsource it with a couple folks too.
Okay.
I did want to also flag that on, the second thing that strikes me is that this to me is more what I would, and Danielle, I would use the words local regulatory authorities or agencies if you're looking for something generic to capture both. You can use LRAs. We use it in a lot of different ways. But this one, number 5, is not, I don't believe this is something that should be in scope of the CAISO's interconnection process. This is an incredibly important issue for us to be discussing with our LRA. So the California Public Utility Commission, number 5 squarely sits in that venue. For the other POUs, those would be their own processes. We definitely need to work on this as an industry. I just want to be clear about who's responsible and who number 5 relates to. The biggest challenge that we see with number 5 is when you look at the achievable CODs, they are sometimes out beyond what a procurement order requires. And so it's not just that their achievable CODs are increasing, it's that it's not connected to the procurement function like we talked about. But number 5, that procurement order is the LRA's responsibility. So I just want to be clear that number 5 is not something not something that is within the authority of the CAISO.
I would agree with you 95%, but the reason I ended up putting it on here is I don't want to take it off the list necessarily just to assume we have no influence whatsoever within our process, or knowing the facts as they are, how this issue plays out with agencies and areas outside our control. What can we do on our end to try to cushion that issue somewhat? So I hope we're on the same page there.
We are definitely on the same page, and I'll work to provide some suggested maybe language that can capture, because I didn't mention permitting. I'll see if I can come up with something concise and work with some other folks and workshop it, and then send you an email with something to suggest it. I definitely think it should be on the list. I just wanted to be very clear in broadcasting that we need to have that conversation for how to fix it in those venues. And if we can figure out a way for the CAISO to help, it'd be great.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm sure everybody understands this, but every once in a while I hear a statement that, well, ISO, you regulate the PTOs. It's like, no, we don't do that. We don't want to do that. So let's make sure everybody understands that. Fernando?
Yeah, Fernando Cornell with Southern California Edison. On number 4, I'm just curious if, I think this was an outcome of a request to have the exploration of an automated process for the studies and to increase efficiencies. But today we already have the power flow and stability analysis that is largely automated. I was just curious if we can get some clarification on what was the ask with number 4 as it relates to the increasing the study efficiencies.
I think it's a matter of, well, first of all, we've received a number of comments that have said there are opportunities out there, okay? And so I think we ought to at least explore what those opportunities look like. I'm by no means the expert in that area, but I think it's something that there is enough interest to determine, or to decide, let's go down that road and see what opportunities might be there. There may be nothing that really plays out that's something we can do, but there could be some opportunities maybe in the front end of how we actually receive and validate interconnection requests at the very beginning. I don't know what there might be for on the study side, but I think it's something that would, I think it warrants being explored.
Okay, I would agree with the first concept on efficiencies being able to, or to improve efficiencies on the intake process. On the study process itself, there's things that are already largely automated, so I'm just not, and I appreciate the fact that there's not a prejudgment here in terms of whether or not there's actually something out there that exists that could improve that process, but to, quote, explore it and not anticipate or not expect the outcome to be that, oh, yes, you got this great opportunity here for increased efficiencies as it relates to the studies. I would agree with the first component of that, the IR, the intake process for the interconnection request, but once you get into the studies, I'm not clear on what we're trying to aim for here with respect to the efficiencies as it relates to the study process.
Yeah, and as I read this, I see, well, it needs to be explored. I think maybe should be explored. It was, I've even grappled with, making these questions. Should we do this? But rather than have questions in the problem statement, I tried to make it into a bit of a, quote unquote problem statement. So as long as you're okay with keeping this, maybe we'll do some tweaking on this too.
Or maybe if we could get clarification from whoever requested this to be added, what they had in mind. Means there's several components of the studies, right? But if we're talking about power flow or stability studies that are already largely automated, what did the individual or the entity have in mind when they suggested that we include this as a guiding principle? Maybe that's a relevant question for whoever submitted it.
And to be honest, I don't think I want to get any further specific in the problem statement as to, what specifically should we look at or where the issues lie. I'd rather leave it pretty open. So I think I can soften this, but still leave it in there that it's something that we would like to explore and see if there is any opportunities in this area, rather than take it for granted, oh, we're there and we're doing everything we can, which may be the case in the study process, but let's just confirm that fact, and maybe that's something within the process that someone from your shop would be willing to do a presentation on what has been done to this point in the study process to fully automate things, so that people can at least say, okay, now that I understand that, let's take that off the table. What other opportunities might there be?
Or we can ask in this room now also about the stakeholder that asked for this to be added, what they had in mind. That's another consideration. Either way, I think softening the language is a good alternative, but we also can ask whoever submitted this as a proposed additional principle, just ask for clarification. What is it they had in mind within the study process that can be, quote, automated beyond what's being done today? But either way, we can soften the language and, explore maybe the right thing to do. But yeah, I mean, there's two options here. We can go back and have our technical experts come back and explain to this group what is currently automated, or since we're already here within this group, the stakeholder that made this a recommended added principle maybe can provide the clarification.
Do you have a hand raised on WebEx?
Okay, go ahead.
Ryan Millard, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Ryan Millard from NextEra. Honestly, I don't think leaving study processes is necessarily detrimental, because if it's not applicable, it can be dropped. This is just a problem statement. So if in the exploration of these things, we find it's not applicable, then we move on. I think for us, when we were talking about technology solutions, we were looking at Amazon Web Cloud Solutions. And I don't know at what point of the process we were looking at specifically. I'd have to go back internally with our SMEs. But if it's not applicable, then I don't think it's something to be too worried about. That's just my 2 cents. So I support your feedback, Bob, on leaving it high level.
Okay, well, seeing we're 2 minutes to 12, I think we're done with this problem statement. And again, Caitlin will provide an email address for you to provide additional, kind of more informal comments and suggestions for us, so please feel free to do that. Yeah, Caitlin, do you want to close us out?
Sure, I will. Let's go back to our presentation here. Jason, I'm going to steal presenting rights from you real quick. All right. Looks like everyone can see the next steps there on WebEx and in the meeting room. So as discussed, we do have 3 working group sessions planned so far. Next Tuesday is going to be our second one. Again, that meeting will start at 9 a.m. and it'll be virtual only. Meeting information is on the ISO calendar and was published in a notice that went out yesterday, I believe. And then that third working group session is planned for July 11th, and we'll look into seeing if we can do a hybrid meeting again for that format, but we'll probably send out a targeted email to folks who attended today, and we'll put that information out in a notice as well. And as Bob mentioned, if you do have any questions or want to send any information our way, please send it to isostakeholderaffairs@kaiso.com, and I'll make sure it gets to the right folks on our team. And then if you're looking for meeting materials related to today's meeting and the recording for these working groups, they will be posted to the initiative webpage there, the first bullet on this slide. So again, thank you everybody for all your participation today and yesterday, and for those of you who attended in person, safe travels home. Have a good one.